correspondence with him once asking him to be on my podcast, and he said he'd love to be, but as a BBC commentator, he watches things that have, political connotations. He can't go on all that, but he was very pleasant to get back to me quickly and charming and all that.
Oh, good, good. Well, then you're up to speed with all the British news.
Yes, fortunately and unfortunately, I am. A lot
More
going
so than I
on.
am.
Yeah. So let me introduce you properly here. We're off and running. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Andrew Lownie, or how do you pronounce your last name?
Loney.
Loney. I knew I had to get it wrong. I was going to try Loney, and then I tried Lowney.
No, most do Loney.
Andrew Lownie. Andrew is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He has been a bookseller, publisher, and journalist writing for The Times, The Telegraph, The Wall Street Journal, Spectator, Guardian, and since 1988 has run his own literary agency. He is president of the Biographers Club and is the author of many prize-winning books. His latest, which we are discussing today, is entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you to please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts when it shows up as a podcast, and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you may also follow my new project at thegospelofzip.com, which is my new book, also read out loud on YouTube, all 8 hours. And thank you to the thousands of people who have watched it so far. You can also support our work by making a tax-deductible donation at georgebailey.org. So, Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today.
Not at all. Pleasure.
So your book came out how long ago, the one we're talking about? When was it actually published? It's not completely new.
Well, Entitled came out in August. I like publishing in August. It gives you a run into the autumn season. It's a little quieter.
Yeah.
And it's really been non-stop since then because we've had this drip feed of material on the royal family and on Epstein, and culminating, of course, in November with Virginia Giuffre's own book. And
Yeah.
that kind of, I think, the zeitgeist had changed. I kind of was feeding into a world that was more prepared, I think, for a more critical book about the royal family
Yeah.
and Andrew's activities particularly with Epstein. And then the whole thing is kind of snowballed because, of course, we've now seen him lose his title, lose his home,
Sure.
his reputation. So it's been extraordinary. Most books have a little moment in the sun, but this, because it's on the news agenda, seems
Yeah.
to continue to
Well,
interest people.
every time I check your Amazon numbers, I'm jealous, and I always wonder how's that going to play with your authors you represent as an agent. Having an agent who's more successful than you are as an author. It's kind of an odd thing to be both an agent and a best-selling author.
Yes, it is. I mean, there are one or two people in publishing who write books. I mean, I have been writing books actually for almost 40 years, but
Yeah.
not perhaps as successfully. And I managed to sort of run the two. Most people didn't even know I wrote books. I mean, they thought it was someone else. But
Yeah.
this has changed things, and I'm acutely aware of the need to make sure I do the day job and
Sure.
that they take priority. But yeah, it is difficult. They wouldn't mind if I played tennis, but the
Yeah,
fact
that's
that
it's a
I'm
little bit
competing.
of a thing. Hey, I'm doing better than you are. You can start every conversation with every author that way. Tell me something about the agency and your trajectory there. Did you found this agency? I don't know the history of it.
Yes, I mean, I graduated from Cambridge in 1984. I went to
Yeah.
work at a publishing house called Hodder and Stoughton
Yeah.
as their trainee, starting in the warehouse. And then after a year there, I actually I would say, almost headhunted to go and work at a literary agency. And this was to go and help with the representation of John le Carre. He
Yeah.
wanted a male agent. There were only female agents in that agency, and his agent, who was in his late 60s at that point, was retiring.
Yeah.
So I had just this good fortune to be brought in. I'd known Le Carre, his son had been at school with me. It shows how the
Mm.
sort of networks work. And I'd met this agent at dinner while I was at university. So I worked at a big agency, Curtis Brown, for 3 years. I became a
Yeah.
director there. And then, I mean, rather foolishly, I went off in 1988 to set up my own agency. rather too early, perhaps. So I've been
Mm.
running this agency almost 40 years now.
That's
It's about
incredible.
200 authors, mainly nonfiction. I do
Yeah, I
some
looked that
fiction.
up and I was very impressed by your list. When were you at Hodder's? What period of time was that?
Hodders was 84 to 85,
Okay,
so
because
just a year.
yeah, coincidentally, I had a lot of connection with Hodder because in my former life as an evangelical sidekick to my evangelical leader father, Francis Schaeffer, and I left that background. But he was first published by Hodder and Stout and produced one of their best-selling books called The God Who Is There, and another one
Right. Well, it had
called
a very strong religious department, if that was
yeah, it did.
presumably.
So I was wondering, I looked at the school you went to up in Scotland, the prep school, and I was going to compare some notes with you on my prep school experience in Sussex at a boys' school called Great Wallstead in Linfield near Haywards Heath. But of course, it was started by the Church of Scotland. And coming from an evangelical fundamentalist background, which I have since fled and written some books about, including a memoir called Crazy for God, which came out about 15 years ago, which has done quite well. I had um, a lot of connection with Hodder because coincidentally, my dad was living in Switzerland, and so his books were first published by British publishers, and Hodder's became his publisher, and I guess they're now owned by Hachette or something. But I'm curious whether you ran across. I'm not thinking you would have, but I'm curious whether that ever came across your desk. One and two, whether the Church of Scotland connection with your prep school. I'm imagining you did chapels and this sort of thing. When you got to Hodder, did you have any religious sensibilities that fit with the company, or was it just an internship and then you moved on?
It was really an internship. I was actually, I think, the first intern who wasn't a member of the family. It was very much of at that stage a
Sure.
family firm, and all the people who worked there were related to the owners. I think there were three conditions or several conditions. One was that you should be a Freemason.
Yeah.
One was you should be a member of the family, and one you should be good at cricket. And I didn't fulfill any three of those conditions, I'm
Yeah.
afraid. So I'm not quite sure why they did get me in,
Yeah.
but anyway, they did. Le Carre was published by Hodder, and I think possibly that
Sure.
was helped make the connection with the Le Carre's agent.
Yeah, it's interesting they had such a strong religious division, and they still do. I actually was a friend of one of the editors who recently retired, but over the years. Anyway, that's not the main point of this interview by any means, but coincidentally, it's interesting to me. When I wrote to you, I said I'd like to talk about your book entitled as a way to look at the subject of all that's gone wrong in the UK since World War One. And I'm particularly interested in that angle because I know, you've done tons of interviews on the book, but having looked at the fact that you did a book on Buchan, who was a big hero of mine as a child, and I until I looked at your book, I didn't know that he was so much more than an author of 100 books, including the 39 Steps and that kind of thing. So I learned a lot from it. But I'm curious because you have been instrumental in taking down, I guess you could put it this way, tabloid style, one of the royals. Um, and at the same time are a royalist, unless I read you wrong, and you're all about the monarchy and you want less corruption and more transparency in order to salvage it, going all the way back to Wallace, the Wally Simpson and the Nazi thing and all the rest of it. There's so many problems that we could talk about. But what I really want to address with you as an observer of British history and as someone who went to school in the UK, a prep school in Sussex, and then a public school in the British sense of the word up in North Wales, that I ran away from, by the way, when I was 16. And the only thing I left with that night, taking the train from Llandudno down to Euston, was the my brand new copy of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So that was my luggage. But anyway, my experience of that has always left me with a fascination about the United Kingdom. When I was at Great Wallstead, I was born in 1952, so I'm 10 years older than you. Some of the working class staff there, Peg and Fred in the kitchen, for instance, were very much the product of the World War One era. And you could see that in the sense that they were a foot shorter than everybody else. The whole working class thing was so evident to me as a child. And then you had the headmaster who had been a Royal Navy captain in World War II, Mr. Braby, who did math with me. I'd been homeschooled and was terrible at it. And he had been a stretcher bearer in World War One. And so I got in on the tail end of British society, and not much had changed in the school So, I might as well have been in a British boys' school in the 1920s or the 1930s instead of the early 60s. So I got a flavor of that. And I
Well, I
left
mean, when I was
I
at
left with a
school,
good sense of the British class system, and I've been fascinated ever since. So I just want to ask you an overall question, and that is, what do you think the health of the United Kingdom is right now? And you can bring in the royalty if you like, but just as a culture, in the same way that I look at America with Trump, and I'm saying, well, what's the health of our nation? What is going on, big strokes in the United Kingdom as far as you're
sure.
concerned?
Well, I mean, actually, fun enough, talking reminiscences. I mean, the school I went to in Scotland, I mean, we were still sitting at desks that went back to the Victorian period
Yeah,
and beds that were probably from the Victorian period.
yeah,
Well, I think, as I talked about the zeitgeist, the sense that elites needed to be held to account and the need to drain the swamp. So the sort of things that Trump's been talking about in America, we've been talking about here. And of course,
yeah,
Nigel Farage, who's likely to be our next prime minister who runs reform, is a close friend of Trump. And there is, I think, this very strong now anti-establishment view or anti-elitist view that the organized parties, Labour, Conservative, and it's up till now been a two-party system, haven't
yeah,
really served people well. We have a big problem here with illegal immigrants. We have pressures on the health service and education and housing,
yeah,
and the economy is not doing very well. So, because of, in some ways, we have a very small base who are sort of supporting everyone else. Many people, excuse me, haven't worked for 3 generations.
yeah,
So there's a great deal of dissatisfaction. A lot of people are leaving. I mean, this has been exacerbated by the Labour government the last year, which has been very anti-business and very pro-welfare. So,
yeah,
it's not great. But I think many of the things that we're seeing on the continent, many things we're seeing in America, we're seeing here in Britain as well.
yeah, exactly.
And I think also what's interesting is, you're absolutely right. I'm a monarchist. I want the monarchy to survive, but
Mm,
in order to survive, it needs to reform. And I am concerned that it has become corrupt, or some members of it have become
sure.
corrupt, and they have undermined the respect for the monarchy and danger of destroying it. And they need to kind of be cleaned out. And I think that there's more and more people like me. I mean, you can see I'm not a dangerous radical.
Right.
Share those views. I go around giving talks at literary festivals in bits of Britain,
Mm,
and army colonels and retired headmasters, are the sort of people who are coming to these talks and saying, "I agree with you."
yeah.
And I think one of the benefits I had when I interviewed this book was that I wasn't a tabloid journalist. I hope I was a serious historian, but
Yeah.
also I think that I had a lot of people who were on the record and serious people who had known Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson,
Yeah.
their former commanding officer in the Falklands, things like that. So I had these very credible people talking,
Mm,
which hadn't always been the case with previous royal books.
yeah. I'm just note something in terms of connections again, besides boarding school. My son was in the United States Marine Corps back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and he fought in Afghanistan twice, once in Iraq. And every time I'd see him afterwards, he would come back, you know, glowing with his connections he was making with people in other militaries, in particular the British Marines, who he said were the best Marines in the world. And he really had a wonderful relationship with them, the Australians, the Danish, who apparently were going to go to war over Greenland with, and all these other people who were serving with him. And so, that connection between the US and the UK was still very live and well, and now seems to have changed a little bit with our president who's talking about Greenland and all these other things. What sort of things are you observing? And this is not the topic of this whole discussion. I'm not going in that direction, but I'm just curious to, apparently King Charles made a good impression on Donald Trump. He goes back and forth on Keir Starmer saying, he likes him, he doesn't like him. Now he's down on him because the prime minister has talked about solidarity with the other Europeans. What do you see the American relationship being now in this present tense of this weird moment of history that doesn't, at least in my life, fit anything that I've experienced before?
Well, I think the vast majority of the American population don't support what Trump's doing,
Yeah.
and are absolutely appalled by the his foreign policy, the way he's dealing with the domestic agenda. and the way that he's created instability in the world. And we're much closer to war, I think, than any stage probably in the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah,
I mean, I've just been on a cruise with 90% Americans. I mean, most of them appalled, equally appalled by what's going on.
yeah,
I don't think, on a personal level, certainly the British, still love the Americans and they love the country.
sure.
I think it's just this particular administration, and I think what's so extraordinary is the way that the administration has been seized by Trump, and very few people are resigning. I mean, I know a lot of people are being sacked. I mean, one of
Mm,
the people I was talking to on the cruise was an ex deputy undersecretary, and was saying how all his colleagues were going, people in the military were being sacked, etc., people in the intelligence services. But I think it is worrying. It's exactly what happened with Hitler in the 1930s.
yeah.
But it is extraordinary how one man can change everything. But in terms of personal relations with America, I think the British still love America, and we still want to go there. We still love the people and the country.
Well, and I think many Americans have not only been in Europe but love Europe. They love the United Kingdom. They love Italy. They go skiing in Switzerland. I mean, there's the idea of making Europe into an enemy is just so foreign to everything that most Americans have experienced that the mind boggles. Couple of little things. Your Queen Elizabeth seems to have been again, getting back to religion a little bit because of my background, was a very sincere believer. She had a relationship with Billy Graham, the American evangelist, who, by the way, was a family friend of ours and I knew quite well. And I'm still friends with one of his daughters, Gigi Graham, who's about 90 now. Um, and so two-part question. Elizabeth, I think was a believer, and then of course the United Kingdom is very secular now. You have a big diminution of attendance at the Church of England, and I'm wondering how you put those two things together in terms of the monarchy uh, being very much part of the Church of England structure, and at the same time, the Church of England seeming to be a bit out of fashion. And then I guess that the way I would put the question bluntly after talking about Elizabeth is, how is secularism working out for the United Kingdom population now? In other words, not from the point of view of being a believer, which I'm not at this point in my life, but um, I'm just wondering how, in your view of this, the monarchy, the Church of England, belief, church attendance, and then the state of Britain, in terms of just how it's doing or not doing in so many areas. I wonder if some of these things are related with a kind of a spiritual lack of confidence or a loss of centeredness it used to be God
Well,
and country. It's certainly
there's a
not God
great
and country anymore.
tension for the monarchy, because, as you say, the Church of England is the established religion. The monarch is the supreme governor of the Church of England. We have bishops in the House of Lords. But we have the situation now where we have no hereditary peers in the House of Lords. The last 90 have just gone.
Yeah,
But yet we still have bishops in the House of Lords.
sure.
But how do you support the hereditary principle on one hand with the monarchy, and yet we don't support it with the peers?
Yeah,
So, I mean, that's one of the tensions. I mean, Charles has tried to be a defender of all the faiths. I mean, he's now dealing with actually the most vibrant religious communities in Britain are basically Islam. And within the Church of England, it's evangelicals. So it's the people who feel very, very strongly about things.
mm,
I was struck coming back from Mumbai day before yesterday on a British Airways flight that I would say 95% of the people on the flight were Indian.
yeah,
And we were served Indian food, Indian curries, I mean, all the way through. So it's, the country has changed. And I live in central London. It's the very few white faces around. It is a very multicultural society. And that,
yeah,
in many ways, is very good. It's very exciting. And we have wonderful restaurants, and we all sort of get along. But, there are also tensions there. And, there is no. I mean, a lot of people don't speak English, which is, extraordinary. I think the Americans are much better at assimilating people. One
yeah,
of the people I met on the cruise, she was a Cuban refugee. He was a German refugee. He'd come to the
mm,
States as a teenager, and yet he'd become a colonel in the American army,
yeah,
and then a
yeah,
diplomat. And they had the American flag, flying on the front lawn. And I think the Americans are much better at assimilating
mm,
outsiders than we are. We allow them to have their own schools, to speak languages, to not learn the language here. and it creates these ghettos, and I think some resentment sometimes and divisions when we should all be the same, and we should all.
Do you think that's particularly the case with the Islamic community? Elon Musk said that the UK is going to wind up as the first nuclear armed Islamic country. And of course, he's awful and he says terrible things. And, then he always says, oh, I'm joking. But when you look at what's going on with Nigel Farage, and of course, the French are going in the same direction and the Hungarians already went there, not everyone went for Angela Merkel's idea of, okay, there's a million Islamic people who want to come on in. And there are people in the United Kingdom who seem to be having second thoughts about this kind of ghettoized community of very fundamentalist religious observance in the middle of a secular culture that neither absorbs them or is able apparently to change any minds. And I'm just wondering how you think about this, other than, it's exciting to live in a multicultural country, the
No,
whole.
it's causing tensions. Of course it is.
Well, and in
We
France,
with
you have 10% of the population that is now Islamic, and you have a whole series of terrorist events over the last 20 years without end. And I wonder how you see this playing out finally for Europe in general and the UK and, say, France in particular.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we have those tensions, and we have the same sort of riots. We have a number of I mean, there's a very high percentage of these illegal immigrants who are committing crimes. We're seeing huge shoplifting sprees. We're seeing
Yeah.
a lot of rapes. Uh, I mean, so I think this is creating great tensions in communities. So it's very difficult, and I think the authorities are often very reluctant to deal with some of these communities. Again, one of the scandals was a grooming gang,
Yeah. Yeah.
Asian grooming gangs of young white English girls,
Sure.
and no one wanted to address this because it
Well,
seemed
and
to be
now they're
racial.
reinvestigating because the first one was sort of a whitewash that the police didn't want to antagonize the Pakistani communities or whoever had been involved.
Exactly, and I think this is, one of the things I argue with entitled that, no one should be above the law. We should all be treated equally under the law.
Yeah.
And Andrew and the royal family were given, were basically allowed to do things they shouldn't be allowed to do, and this has happened with some of these communities. So, it is worrying what's going on. People have lost trust in the accepted the sort of established parties. Are looking for at extremists. We're getting polarized.
Yeah.
People are much less tolerant of each other, and the whole thing has fragmented. We have a first past the post system in this country. I think we're going to be moving to some sort of proportional representation because we're getting, in terms of voting intentions,
Yeah.
5 or 6 different parties, all roughly with 20% or just under of the vote. We're going to see alliances, in the way that the Europeans have had, which can
Yeah.
create very unstable government.
Yeah.
So,
I have
things are changing.
how do you think this relates to the British class system? And I'll sort of couch the question a bit differently. Is there a difference between the traditional British aristocracy, and I'll put it this way, the sort of country parties where there were affairs of the upper classes and this was winked at and it went very much against middle class morality. You had the kind of lower classes, Victorian England, prostitution in London, but then the middle class had this kind of, you know, Victorian ethic, and then the country parties and so forth. And so, you look at someone like Prime Minister Asquith in World War One, and he's driving around in his car with a young woman who is, 20 years old and showing her national secrets, including battle plans for tomorrow morning on the front. Um, so it seems to me that, when you look at these kind of things, the British class system, when it comes to the Andrews of this world, this is not something new. This has been part and parcel of the aristocracy going back a long way.
Yes, I mean,
You mentioned the
there's a good
monarchy.
reason why I call the book entitled, because that's exactly what it is.
Yeah,
I think we have to be careful with our definitions. I mean, aristocracy doesn't really exist now. I mean,
right.
really since the Second World War. Sorry. So I'm going to shut that down. So sorry about that.
No
I've tried to
problem.
unplug the phone.
Till the
Do-
19th of January. You know,
Sorry, I have to call you back. Okay, bye. Um, Sorry about that.
No
The
problem.
aristocracy has changed since the Second World War. I mean, a lot of them have lost their land, they've lost their
Sure.
particular privileges. And I would say that there are plenty of middle class people who are having affairs and running around, and the people in authority who are giving away secrets. So I
Yeah.
think the royal family still believes that they can kind of do what they want, and they'll be protected. But I don't think that's true of most people. But
Yeah, how does that fit in with sort of the I mean, one thing that I'd like to just because you're a historian, I've always tried to understand how the Norman conquest worked in that, here they arrive, 1066 and all that, and then all of a sudden there's this enormous, the Anglo-Saxons are right out and it's all Normans all the way down, and the Normans turn out to be a bunch of Vikings who settled in northern France. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. And then they arrive in the UK and build cathedrals and castles, and they dispossess the land, what would have been the closest to the landed gentry. And as I understand it, there are still swathes of London and Surrey and so forth that are owned by families that can trace their lineage all the way back to the Norman conquest. And sort of, so I've always looked at that as a kind of a uniquely odd thing that is very, very unique to the United Kingdom. Not very, you don't find anything similar in most of Europe, certainly not in the US. And I'm just wondering if you think that sets the stage for some of these things in some odd way, because obviously the royalty itself is connected with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the biggest estates in Britain are owned by the royal family, the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster.
Yeah,
And that's clearly one of the big debates. I mean, about whether these estates, which could, control, for example, parts of London, and make a lot of money. They control the seabed around Britain and with all the wind farms. Whether that money should be going to the royal family or should be
yeah,
going to the state. And at the moment, we have a system where a percentage of it goes as the sovereign grant to the royal family, but it's done a percentage. It's actually a very large sum now because there are record profits being made. There are one or two very wealthy families. The Duke of Westminster is the classic example because
yeah.
he owns very large parts of central London. But otherwise, there are very few big landowners in the south of England. They're mainly in Scotland and the north of England.
Mm.
And they're not in urban areas. They're in often rural areas where there's not much that could be done except, to have grouse and grouse moors, etc. So,
But do you think some of that sets the stage for some of the corruption you talk about in terms of the word entitled being that's what your book is called, and it seems to me that it can't just be the royal family alone in that it's a lot of things connected with it. And then on the other hand, just to put it in perspective, of course, I'm not picking on the UK. The Trump has enriched himself by over $1.5 billion in the first year of his presidency, and he staggered into the presidency as sort of a humbled millionaire, having failed at many businesses. And he's gotten more wealthy in 12 months than all the rest of his career and efforts put together. So obviously, corruption on that scale is not what has gone on with the royal family, at least in recent times. But on the other hand, it just seems uniquely connected to the aristocracy, or what was once the aristocracy. And I'm wondering, as you look at it, when you say you're a royalist, does the whole class system come with that, or can you separate the two and still have Charles as king or whoever is the next heir carry on without the burden of maintaining this sort of thing that I ran into as a child in Great Wallstead, where the domestic staff were one kind of specimen of the human race, and the upper classes looked and totally differently, everything from tooth decay to you name it. And that's not the same in the States. I have, somebody that helps in my garden, and he's a fireman and he's a former Marine. And if you saw him and his teeth and his posture and the size he is and what his diet has been, you wouldn't say, oh, well, this is a working class guy. Whereas when I was in boarding school, the working class were very deprived looking, as well as you could see it. I mean, diet and all the rest of it. And I don't think
well,
most Americans understand the weight of that.
yes, to a certain extent, the richer you are, often the thinner you are because you're eating better and more aware
Yeah,
of the importance of diet. So, of course, we have those sort of divisions, but I would say we're pretty socially mobile. People actually, the problem is the middle class careers have been taken over by AI.
yeah,
And we see lots of university students, who are having to do sort of blue collar jobs that
sure.
And I think when I'm always struck, I often have driven to talks and things, and I find that, the people who are driving me are often middle class people who just want the freedom of running their own business and
Sure.
running their own time, and have had quite interesting careers before that. I mean, quite distinguished careers. And certainly, you'll have taxi drivers whose children are now, university professors. That there is this ability in Britain still to rise quickly. We have opportunities, though the state system isn't brilliant. A lot of the private schools give 100% bursaries. They're very
Sure.
keen to be needs blind. We still have grammar schools, which are state schools, but which
Yeah.
are academically rigorous. So, we are keen. I mean, any country wants to have the best and the brightest in order
Yeah.
to prosper.
I have a question about the kind of things that are going on now. Um, I guess I'm going to ask it this way. You're from Scotland. Why is Scotland so far to the left compared to the rest of the United Kingdom? Tom Holland, the historian, says that the post-Reformation thinking that he writes about in Dominion is that secularized Christian ideals taken to when they become secularized, nevertheless, the impact of the teaching of Jesus when he says, have room for the least of these and so forth and so on, carried into a secularized context means that, we're all about gay rights and trans rights and these other things, and that people think that's secularism, but actually it's the logical conclusion of a certain kind of evangelical thinking and idealism. And so, when I look at J.K. Rowling and her conflict with Scotland over trans issues, centers on vocal opposition to gender self-identification laws and all of this, I'm wondering how you see that. And the context I'm looking for an answer in is, what I feel there would, in the US, a lot of the reaction that gave us Trump from his base was to the perceived insults that they had been receiving since the sexual revolution when it came to, gender, sexuality, and all these things. Real or imagined, that's not what I'm talking about. But there was an overreach by the left in the US, I guess, that goes under the title of woke and so forth. And you see that very much with J.K. Rowling's relationship to the Scottish government. And I'm just wondering, from your point of view, I'm just curious on the way by, no big thing, but why is Scotland so far to the woke left as opposed to the rest of the UK, let alone the rest of Europe? And then I just think it's odd. And given the Church of Scotland background and the Presbyterians who came to America and founded the Bay State and all that kind of thing. And then the other question I have is, do you think that with Farage and the immigration policy and so forth, just as our open borders under Biden led to the Trump pushback, and now we have armed thugs in our streets wearing ice jackets, gas masks, and no name tags, throwing people to the ground who are American citizens, and we've gone totally in the other direction. But I'm wondering if you feel that the left somewhat, sowed the seeds of the pushback, and say the J.K. Rowling thing in Scotland, and now the High Court of Britain has gone back to traditional gender terms when it comes to sex differences. And it seems the pendulum swinging the other way, that this culture war stuff, a lot of it, the left doesn't want to take any blame for this, but I think there was some overreach. That's my opinion. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just wondering how you see it.
Well, I mean, the J.K. Rowling has stood out not just in Scotland, but I mean, in Britain. I mean,
Right.
it is an interesting question. I mean, the Scots actually were voted predominantly Conservative until quite recently. I mean, there
Yeah.
are more Scottish Conservative MPs than Labour SNP. I think it's tied into the issue of Scottish nationalism, the sense of the Scottish Nationalist Party as the party of the left. I think a lot
Yeah.
of people, a bit like voting Brexit, a lot of people voted perhaps with their hearts rather than their heads.
Yeah.
And as a result, they got the SNP, who
That's the Scottish
pushed
National Party for people who don't.
pushed things to the left,
Yeah.
and it became much more a dependency culture, having been very independent. Because you say these are the people. You've also got to remember that a lot of the most enterprising people in Britain and in Scotland left. They were more opportunities for them, particularly first of all in the Empire. A lot of them moved south to England, and so some of the best and the brightest leave Scotland because the opportunities there are more limited.
Yeah.
It's clearly a much smaller country, and so you kind of get left with a slightly more parochial and I suppose less entrepreneurial element to
Yeah.
it. And also, of course, a lot of the industries have gone now. Those industries were not replaced. I mean, in Ireland, we saw high-tech industries, a low-tax regime come in
Mm.
because Southern Ireland were different. I mean, Northern Ireland is another problem, rather like Scotland.
Yeah.
So, and you're right. There, of course, there's always a pushback when things go too far one way. People begin to resent special privileges given to certain groups,
Yeah.
or just feel that they're out of step with how people feel.
Yeah, a friend of
Um,
mine who was an assistant, I made four crappy Hollywood movies back in the 80s, and which I directed in Hollywood and around the world before I was lucky enough to write a successful novel called Portofino set in Italy, which gave me permission for a writing career. And I'm 12 books later, whatever, fiction and nonfiction. But back in the day in Hollywood, my assistant director on a movie called Wired to Kill was a Scottish young man who had been part of, I think, what was it, the Scottish Liberation Army or something? It was like the Scottish IRA. Is that correct?
yep, yep.
Yeah, and he had been arrested and done time for blowing up some power lines, and then came to the States when immigration policy, wasn't as strict, and he got in and became a successful assistant AD in assistant director in Hollywood. But anyway, he would talk about Scotland and nationalism in much the way that the Irish did, and then the National Party, which through the vote, got more power and this kind of thing. And again, I just think it's very odd that it wound up as one of the most liberal democracies in Europe, to the point where other people. So how do you think the J.K. Rowling thing played out? Because it looks to me like she won in terms of the High Court ruling and all the rest of it. It
Yes, I
swings
think
back the other way.
yeah, there is a pushback against trans rights. I mean, there've been one particularly influential book, which raised some disturbing questions about young people who were allowed to transition
Yeah,
and then regretted it. So, there is all these things. There's always a corrective. But it is extraordinary. Things can go as far as they've gone.
yeah. Getting back to you, how did you do your research for this book entitled, and what were your methods? Because I know that I've seen you talk about it before, and I read in the book, you had to do your homework because obviously, there was a lot of liability involved. So you crossed your T's and dotted your I's and all the rest. But I'm just curious on your sort of methods, if any, on that. Did you, how long did you work on it? But also, how do you keep track of the royalty in the UK and their corruption and this sexual deviance and all the rest, when of course their whole thing has been to not only sweep things under the carpet, but the palace, as the British say, does everything in its power to obscure what's going on. So you're not only researching something, you're researching something hidden. And I would just like to know, off the top of your head, how that all works for you, how you've done it.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, there are no documents, and I fought for years using freedom of information laws to try and get access to material which I didn't get access to. So in the end, I'm reliant on interviews, and I approached about 3,000 people. I got
Yeah,
300 people to talk to me, half of them on the record.
yeah,
But a lot of people clearly were scared, didn't want to talk, signed NDAs,
yeah,
or still feel very deferential towards the royal family, and feel that, my mother-in-law, for example, feels that the royal family can do no wrong, that, even if they behave badly, we should have to just accept that they are
yeah,
different. So, and there are a lot of people, I mean, she's in her 90s, a lot of people feel that. But it is difficult. I think one of the things that's been very interesting since the book's come out, a lot of people have come out of the woodwork and more prepared to talk to me for the updated paperback, about three a day.
yeah,
And so I think there were people, they didn't know perhaps who to talk to in the past. They wanted to get their stories out. They were appalled by what was going on. And I became allowed to be a focus for that.
Have you
And I
ever
think
met
as people,
Charles or have you ever gotten any reaction from the king himself at any point in his life or people close to him, or do they just keep quiet about this?
no, I mean the line is never explain, never complain. So I
Right.
mean, though clearly behind the scenes, they I know they got hold of an early copy of the book. They looked to see if they could sue me. They've clearly been briefing against me. A lot of pressure was put on publications not to cover the book. A lot of people came out to dismiss me as not a serious person.
Yeah.
I've had stuff said that I'm a paedophile and use sex workers and all sorts of things. So, a lot of stuff is thrown at one, for trying to tell the truth about the past. All I ever
Yeah.
claim to be is a biographer and historian. I'm not out with any agenda except to try and tell the truth about the past.
What do you think the impetus is in the royal family for this sort of never explain thing? I mean, it hasn't worked very well. This is what happened back in World War II with the Nazi sympathizers in the royal family and so forth. How do you think Charles and the younger generation following him think about the future of the monarchy, if anything? How does it survive in a world of transparency and iPhones and all the rest of it? Because this just doesn't seem to be possible in the future we're headed into.
Well, I don't think Charles is a great reformer, and I don't think William is going to be a great reformer. I mean, they like the system as it is, and it's served them very well. I think what's pushing things is social media
Yeah,
and people power, and I think that's what helped. In the end, the king was forced; he was being heckled, forced to take away titles.
yeah,
But they don't tend to listen to their advisors. They tend to just stick their head in the sand and hope the problem will go away.
yeah,
And I don't see that really changing much. But it was people pressure that persuaded the media to be slightly more, shall we say, critical of the royal family. A lot of
mm.
stuff that I wrote about, they knew about, but just weren't prepared to talk
Weren't
about.
saying, yeah,
And I think also the parliamentary pressure which has begun came from constituents who are saying to MPs, if you want our vote, you have to deal with this, in the way that pressure has been put on the DOJ to release the Epstein material.
yeah.
Politicians who had fought against this for a long time realized that unless they were seen to do something, they would be losing their seats.
Yeah, because in your book you talk about the fact that the royal family at this time, or the institution of the monarchy, seems, I think, in your words, to be on a collision course with modern British values. And then, again, we had already talked about the sort of the irrelevance of the benediction of the Church of England in an irreligious country like Britain, because I think Britain's one of the most irreligious countries on earth. It seems to me that I wonder, just off the top of your head, do you think the monarchy survives another 100 years? Do you think it goes away? I mean, how does it change to stay in business? Does it become like the Dutch royal family or the Scandinavian royals, sort of lower profile? I mean, how does this go another generation with? I mean, where's Farage on this and the sort of new right wing people? Are they royalists? I mean, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I mean, I think probably we will move to a more low-key monarchy, more like the European model, with just the direct line of succession,
Yeah,
people having their titles taken away. We certainly won't have all the royal palaces accommodating minor members of the family at subsidized rent. So all those
yeah.
things are going to change. More, I hope, more transparency and accountability, a more focus on public service and rather less on private pleasure.
Hmm.
But who knows how it's going to play out? I mean, they have managed to preserve their privileges for a lot longer than most people expected. I
Yeah.
think it will survive. It may become less relevant to people. I mean, young people don't feel that the monarchy it serves any role in their lives.
Hmm. Hmm.
But except, we have seen you were talking about King Charles and the way that he basically used the soft power of the monarchy to charm Trump in a way that Keir Starmer couldn't do. So there is a
Hmm.
role
Hmm.
there. So there was a good reason why Andrew was made a trade envoy, because the royal family can reach places, particularly in the Middle East, that other envoys couldn't. So there is a role for them. This is why I'm a great supporter of it. It is a unifier in the country and a focus, but it only retains respect and support if it behaves properly and doesn't be
Hmm.
seen to be abusing its position.
Let me ask you a little bit about your work as an agent. How, I've asked when I interviewed the editor of the Wall Street Journal, or who's now emeritus, who's British, Jerry Baker is his name, I think. Um, anyway, he was saying that he's a patriotic Englishman, I think also a royalist and so forth, but at the same time very critical of the institution. And I wonder how you balance those two things in the sense of, I'm not saying that you see yourself this way, but as someone who is credited for, quote, taking down Prince Andrew and getting his title taken away, with the book being a big part of that. And then also rooting for the continuation of the British royal family. Um, I'm wondering how those two things work together in your own mind when it comes to editorial decisions for the authors you represented. Do you happen to have other people coming to you as an agent who are attracted by your track record as an author, social activist, anti-corruption crusader, if you want to put it this way, or is it totally watertight compartments and you do a completely different kind of thing with your authors?
Well, I mean, to go back to the first part of your question, I mean, you can still support an institution even if you think there's some rotten apples in it.
Sure.
I mean, until I suppose my last three books, so until, 6 or 7 years ago, I was writing literary biography, books on intelligence. But I've always been drawn in the agency to taking books that challenge the orthodoxy,
Yeah.
that don't but necessarily conform, that deal with social ills. So that's always been an element. I've always done lots of investigative journalists. And
Yeah.
I've always kept my own views very distinct. People didn't know what my own political views, for example, were. I don't think they probably still know. And I've always represented books that I don't always agree with.
Hmm.
Um, so there are plenty of books on the far left and on the far right, which
Sure.
I wouldn't support personally, but I believe in free speech. I believe these people
Yeah.
should be making their case, and I think the purpose of publishing is to if this is a business, it's about making money, and if
Yeah,
we
of
can
course.
sell those books and present, then we should do them. We shouldn't, for example, I have a biography of Nigel Farage I'm selling. Now, a lot of publishers won't touch that because they don't like Nigel Farage, but
Sure.
he is an important figure in British politics.
Yeah.
He deserves to have a biography. It's actually quite a critical biography.
Who's writing it, by the way?
It's written by a Sunday Times journalist called Carlos Alba.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, no, I
And
have
when
kept the
will
two
when will
very
that be
separate.
out? Because I want to read that and interview him in case you want to set us up, because I'm very
Well,
interested for
I
us.
haven't sold it yet. I mean, this is one of the extraordinary things. Someone with, a good track record like Carlos and on a very popular subject, we've had some trouble selling it.
But don't you
And
think that's part of the reason of the pushback in terms of the left? Because this is so typical of the US as well. And that is, the scuttlebutt is that young male authors have trouble selling novels to companies dominated by feminist female editors. I'm not saying that's true, but that's the scuttlebutt. And well-known writers like my friend Andre Dubus, who wrote The House of Sand and Fog, thinks that a lot of his male students are getting very short shrift now as young writers with feminist
yep, no, no,
editors.
it's absolutely true. I couldn't sell a book, putting in some ways the male equivalent of a feminist. I couldn't sell that book. No one would buy it.
Yeah,
And I think the thing is, in the old days, editorial led, it was often just one person buying a book over lunch. Now it's a group decision.
sure.
And most publishers, I would say it's 80–90% female. So I ran a publishing company for a while, and we did a lot of books which we didn't think were getting published. So, for example, male fiction, World War II stories,
Sure.
westerns, all those sort of books that weren't of interest to female editors, but actually had a market because there was a readership out there.
Yeah.
But there are very few male editors in publishing, so and indeed very few male agents. So of course we're going to have a slightly scanty view, and I think people are shaped by their personal views, which is a shame because
Yeah.
I think it's all about tolerance. It's all about perhaps coming outside your comfort zone and doing books that opening your eyes, I suppose, to other points of view.
Yeah. I
But
mean, part of
that's
the
the world we
Trump
live in.
push, yeah, part of the Trump pushback, exacerbated by people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and these others on the tech bro side, has been very much about this in the sense of saying, we're sick of living in a female dominated culture with sort of 1970s second wave feminism, through women's studies programs, and all of a sudden women 40, 50 years old in charge of everything when it comes to publishing and choices and so on. And so part of the pushback has been to go very far the other way, where now you have this online manosphere, which is horribly misogynistic, very foul-mouthed, anti-woman. People are harassed all the time. I mean, how did we get to this? Because when I grew up, there was a sort of a normal baseline You wouldn't have Trump accumulating $1 billion in his first year of the presidency. These people would all be anomalies. Elon Musk having 14, 15, 16 children by 6 different women by in vitro fertilization, checking out the embryos to make sure they're going to have a high IQ. There just seems to be a lot of stuff now that is torn from the pages almost of science fiction. I don't know your view, but I'm 73 and I went through the Nixon Watergate thing. I had a son fight in Afghanistan. I've seen some things. Grew up in the missionary family, left that, directed movies in Hollywood. I have some life experience, but I've never seen anything like the last 6, 7 years of my life ever, or even imagined it could happen. Whether it's the manosphere, the pushback, the feminist takeover of publishing, everything just seems to be in extremes now, and it's very hard to navigate. I get the same thing on this podcast in our little way. I hear from listeners saying, well, if you're going to have the editor of the Wall Street Journal on, I'm never watching you again because that's the liberal point of view. How could you have someone like this? Don't you know it's a Murdoch paper? This kind of thing. What do you feel, just human to human, and someone with your experience as an editor, as a writer, as an observer? I mean, what has happened to us, and where does this go?
Well, I don't know where it goes. I mean, I think it's a shame because I am a believer that, we should all listen to other people's points of views. We should be open to other cultures, but without losing a sense of our own culture.
Yeah,
Um, but all one can do is I have the same problem talking about members of the royal family. Often, if I say something about Harry or Meghan or William or Catherine, it's not my own opinion.
yeah,
It's actually often fact. It's actually what's happening. But because people are operating in an echo chamber, and that's the problem because with the media generally now,
yeah.
they don't want to hear about it, and I'll be cancelled because I've said something. And it's not necessarily even just my point of view. It's often a factual thing.
Sure.
So
Yeah, they don't want
it's
to hear. They don't want to hear it. For instance, the proportion of women editors and the amount of young men being published is a fact. That's not just to be disputed, and yet to even mention that fact puts you in sort of the dark shade of these people who want to pretend that this isn't happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And and we saw it with what was going on in Gaza. There were some people who said that Israel can do exactly what it wants. Others who said this is a humanitarian disaster.
Yeah,
Um, and again, very polarized the whole thing. And I think there are often two sides to anything, and we need to listen and need to try and understand and to accept. I mean, I have plenty of friends whose views I don't agree with, but doesn't mean I can't be friends with them.
yeah, exactly. Let me ask you something specific about the book because you talk about Donald Trump in it, and obviously the book was about the British royals, but you must have some sort of opinion on the fact that he seems to have done his best through the Justice Department and everything else to take revenge on anybody who wants the total disclosure of what happened between him and Jeffrey Epstein over decades and decades of relationship. What do you know that might be of interest to me or other people that might be in the book or not be in the book or inferred by the book? Because the Trump story is shaping his presidency to the point where credible people are saying that this business about taking Greenland and making war on Europe to get it and all the rest is basically one huge smokescreen to draw attention away from something that he's very afraid of on a number of issues, but one of them being the criminal association he had with this internationally known, pedophile ring that in this case was for real, with people flying on the Lolita Express and all this stuff down to this island. So what, besides what's in your book or in addition to it, or just what is your impression of Trump's involvement in this whole sordid mess?
Well, we know Trump was basically rescued from some of his financial problems by the Russians. We know he's deeply compromised. We know, there are a whole series of cases being brought against him for abusing women. So
Yeah,
I mean, he has no reputation to lose. I mean, he of course is deeply involved with Epstein. He's covering that all up. That relationship went on much longer.
yeah,
I mean, there was a sentence taken out of the book showing that Epstein had introduced Melania to Trump, which he didn't like. Um, but I have plenty of testimony. Again, there's another sentence with Trump and Andrew having locker room conversations about women and swapping lists of masseurs and things. So,
Yeah.
he doesn't come out of this well, he comes out of it exactly as he presents himself, as a pretty despicable human being. Um, but yeah, there's lots of stuff on Epstein, and there's a lot of stuff on Clinton, for example,
Yeah, of
in the
course.
Epstein material, which has all been covered up. I mean, he's not unique here. There are
No.
plenty of politicians. We saw Peter Mandelson, the British ambassador in the States, having to resign because of his associations. Ehud Barak is clearly very deeply involved. And there are plenty of others who've been named and others who I think will shortly be named. But, they hide behind expensive lawyers and big PR companies, and it's often very difficult for the press to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at this whole thing, it brings up a question about the kind of moral fiber of the upper echelons of our leadership in both countries. And you really wonder whether this is just better known now because of the age we are in with the internet and so forth, or whether there has been a real slippage here. If you've got Asquith sort of mucking about in World War I, but at least he was just chasing one young woman that he was in love with and weirdly, uh, chasing around. But this isn't new to history. Eisenhower had his mistress and so forth. But it seems to me that, when you look at Trump and you look at these other guys, you're into another level here. And
Yes, well, I think so. Now, I'm going to have to draw this to a close, I'm afraid,
yeah, you
because
have a
I've got
hard out.
something else. We've had our hour, and I'm afraid I've got something else I've got to go to.
No problem. Let me just say, get in touch, please, with my producer, Ernie, and make sure we have your contact information so that we can get the links to you, but also follow up with maybe some of your authors that you think I'd be interested in talking to who do get published, like the Naja Faraj biographer or someone else. Please keep me and my podcast in mind because I'm someone who is interested in everybody and talks to them and does as good a job as I can to prepare to have those discussions.
Great. Of course, I will. But it's been lovely chatting to you, and we'll carry on the conversation another time, I hope.
I'd love to talk to you some more and all the best. Cheers. Good luck with everything and
Thanks a
well
lot.
done on a terrific